this is how you recognize a truly great thinker. That, of course, there are phenomena where Hegel fell short, couldn't grasp them. But it's not in the sense that, there was some totally different logic which Hegel wasn't able to grasp. It is more as if what escaped Hegel in some phenomena was the very Hegelian dimension of it. Like the Hegel didn't see it. What do I mean by this? Okay, let me begin in a very simple, honest, empiricist way by a series of topics, concepts, operative, important in our times, where one can claim Hegel really cannot think them. First, the concept of repetition. I already spoke about this, I want to repeat it. The point is, what kind of repetition? We all know Hegel does have even a very nice theory of repetition. But it's a repetition which is never, let's call it zero repetition, just repetition. It's always a repetition through idealization or Aufhebung, sublation. Like, the classical examples. The idea is what first happens and appears is experienced as something contingent. Through repetition, it is aufgehoben, turned into a notion. Like ultra classical example, I'm sorry, I repeat it all the time. Hegel's beautiful theory of Caesar. Caesar, first we have Caesar as a name, that guy who screwed Cleopatra and so on, Julius Caesar. Then we get Caesar dies and returns precisely as Caesar the title, as a universal notion, idealization. It's, in this sense, what Hegel cannot think, we may say, but is it true? I think it's more ambiguous. It's pure repetition. Repetition without this moment of idealization, Aufhebung. In other words, and I think Gilles Deleuze is right when he focuses on two strange bedfellows which are part of the same, sorry to use this obscene word, spiritual constellation, Kierkegaard and Freud. I think Deleuze is right in emphasizing that there are two aspects to so-called post-Hegelian or post-idealist break in the 19th century. We usually focus too much on this Marxian aspect of, and Feuerbach and so on, positivity, like against the self-enclosed circle of ideas, the assertion of some positive reality and so on. But I think this is maybe even the less important part of the post-Hegelian break. What is truly new is repetition. Repetition in Kierkegaard, it's crucial. You know that the whole Kierkegaard's edifice is Christianity, religion as repetition against philosophy. For Kierkegaard, from Socrates or Plato rather to Hegel, like Erinnerung, rememoration. And of course in Freud, it's absolutely crucial, the compulsion to repeat, which as Freud emphasizes is precisely this blind compulsion. So this is the first thing. The second thing, unconscious. Now I will immediately elaborate this, because in a way Hegel definitely can think an unconscious, and I checked it up, even Lacan is aware of it. He says, I think, I may be wrong, that it's in Seminar on Identification, that there is a Hegelian unconscious, but Lacan insists not the same as Freudian. Overdetermination. Then, this is the truly hard point, modern formalized science. Hegel obviously dismisses it as something pertaining to understanding as opposed to authentic reason, mechanical, and so on. And we can then say, can Hegel really think class struggle, antagonism, like class struggle, like sexual difference, and so on. Now I want to complicate things a little bit, because, you know, apropos each of these topics, we can demonstrate that it's never a question of Hegel simply cannot do it. It's, yes, he cannot do it, but, for example, with repetition, I will return it at the very end. I think, nonetheless, that we can find traces of precisely a non-productive repetition in Hegel. It's there in the background, but it's there. Where? And again, if there will be time, but I suspect there will not be time, so I'm now, so that my conscience will be clear, I will announce it. Some of the apparently most problematic reactionary parts of Hegel have precisely this dimension. For example, let me go to the darkest of the darkest, Hegel's deduction of the necessity of war, which is supposed, opposing to this Kantian dream of eternal peace. If you look closely at the reasoning behind it, you can see that Hegel was not, as he is usually interpreted by liberals today, Hegel was not into this dream of a bourgeois society as prose, like prosaic society, the antagonisms are over, we lead our peaceful lives and so on. For Hegel, there has to be from time to time a war, not for any militaristic reasons, but for a purely conceptual necessity that precisely there cannot be lasting peace between universal and particular. That from time to time, okay, Hegel gives here a reasoning which may sound almost reactionary, but I claim it's not. The idea is that from time to time, we citizens living in our more or less satisfied, petty lives, each at our place, have to be reminded from time to time of the strength of abstract negativity. Like Hegel puts it in a wonderful, brutal way, appropriate to his time. Now we would have even more horrible examples when he says that it's easy for a religious man to claim, the vanity of all earthly life. No, but he said that this we do it in a hypocritical life. You say vanity, all eternal life is vain, and then you go to a nice restaurant and so on. No, but Hegel says it's slightly different when you really get this lesson, like when a foreign soldier with a saber is killing, he mentions like the Russians, when the Cossack is killing your family in front of your house, you get the same lesson, but you get it for the real, of the vanity of the... So what I'm saying is that here is one example of how it's not true that Hegel's ultimate vision is that of peace of the developed, prosaic, bourgeois society. He knows that there is an excess of negativity which repeatedly has to be reasserted. And if there will be time, what I would like to do, because this is the game I will be playing today, push Hegel forwards, beyond Hegel, but through Hegel. I think what I will try, some of the developments may be even known to you, is to show, apropos 3-4 topics, how Hegel was inconsistent with himself. Where was he inconsistent? I claim that what Hegel, because again, the point of his theory of war is that, again, the meaning of the war is not external. It's not from time to time we have to show to the others that we are stronger or whatever. No. The true meaning of war is purely that you should experience your own abstract freedom, negativity, and so on. So what Hegel should have done is what I'm tempted to call and it can be, I will do it in my next book, the one that you graciously mentioned, much more in detail, namely to demonstrate how, what Hegel should have done there. What I like to call the Thomas Jefferson step. To say not only war with outside, but from, this wonderful totalitarian metaphor of Thomas Jefferson, that the tree of liberty has to be watered by blood from time to time. And even here, an idea came to me, a Hegelian idea of synthesis of the opposites. This is what I like about the Jacobins, where in their terror, the state terror against the individuals, everyone could have been guillotined, in a way overlaps by the popular terror. It's both at the same time. I think we need to shake us up from time to time, some kind of Jacobinical terror. I would even go a step further and say that the status of this terror is the same as the status of madness. in that, what do you think, that you own the world and can be late or what? Okay, sorry. He's my best friend, you can guess from what I said. I published it in a book with Continuum, together with the German guy Marcus Gabriel, Hegel's Theory of Madness. Again, he is more Foucault than Michel Foucault, I claim there. He wonderfully developed how madness is not just an abstract possibility, but it's a necessary step on the path to humanity. Humanity you don't pass from animal to human directly. You have to go through this step of, at least, threat of madness. It's only as a reaction to madness that the properly human dimension of what Hegel calls Gewohnheit, customs, emerges. And Hegel also has there a wonderful theory how mechanical customs, discipline, you learn something without understanding it, is the basis of all humanity. You have to begin with this blind drill and so on. Only then. So again, there he is consequent, Hegel. There he admits that it's not that madness as a possibility of this outbreak of radical negativity is sublated, aufgehoben in some higher spiritual unity. No, it's only that it always remains there lurking beneath as a possibility to explode. All that Hegel had to do, but was a little bit too conformist, is to follow, again, his own logic also to the domain of social order, war, and so on. Okay, more about this later. Let me move now to the unconscious. I think that linked to this topic of the unconscious is the topic of overdetermination. Here we can make a good argument that Hegel, what he cannot do is the Freudian unconscious. That is to say, Hegelian unconscious is a transcendental unconscious of the form. You know how in one of the key passages of the introduction to phenomenology, when Hegel describes the emergence of a new form of life, he says it happens, but the individuals just experience it as coming from nowhere. They don't see its formal aspect. And Hegel repeats this again and again, like when we speak, we don't see the universal character of what we say. You know, already at the most elementary, the beginning of phenomenology, sense certainty. When Hegel says, you say now, you mean this now. What you don't know is that it's a universal every now, and so on. So again, for Hegel, unconscious is the abstract form. The Freudian unconscious, of course, is totally particular contingent. Like, this is maybe what Hegel cannot think, sorry to mention an example that you maybe know, in, for example, one of the wonderful dreams that I really like from Freud's interpretation of dreams is a woman patient who reports to Freud a dream that she was at a funeral, felt very sad, and so on and so on. Then Freud discovers again, what's the meaning of the dream? It's that at that funeral, she encountered her ex-love and was very glad about it. But in no way can you get at this point through a hermeneutic analysis of the dream. Everything is there to cheat. She feels sad, funeral, and so on and so on. You see, the whole point is this totally contingent partial connection. This brings us to overdetermination. Hegel, in a formal sense, can think overdetermination, again, in this formal sense of what he calls oppositional determination, that an element can be overdetermined by itself, in the sense that, as even Marx refers to this in the that introduction to Grundrisse, methodological introduction, how you have four species, no, production, distribution, exchange, consumption, and that production encounters itself as its own species, is in this purely formal sense overdetermined. But again, what Hegel cannot think is the complex network of particular links organized along the contingent lines of condensation, displacement, and so on. Or in more general terms, the Hegelian process always deals with radical, clear-cut solutions or resolutions. What is foreign to Hegel is the Freudian logic of pragmatic, opportunistic compromises. This is, I think, maybe the true limit. Not that Hegel was not radical enough, but that Hegel was too radical, in the sense that, when you have a tension, Hegel's automatic reaction is, let's push it to the end, resolve it. While isn't the whole of Freudian unconscious one big shitty compromise? In the sense of, I like that, but I don't want to admit it, so let's do a compromise, let's stage it, but let's not quite admit it, and so on and so on. So we get a kind of a complicated network of distortions where again, there is no clear resolution. Just think about maybe Freud's most famous example, that of Signorelli from the beginning of Psychopathology of Everyday Life. You know the story. Freud himself couldn't recall the name of the painter of the Orvieto frescoes, Signorelli, and produce as substitutes the names of two other painters, Botticelli and Boltraffio. And then his analysis brings to light the process of associations which links Signorelli to Botticelli and Boltraffio. The village, Trafoi, was where Freud received the message of the suicide of one of his patients. Hair like signor, hair, the German word for master, is linked to a trip to Herzegovina, Bosnia and Herzegovina, when an old Muslim told Freud that after you no longer can engage in sex, there is no reason to go on living, and so on and so on. But you see the point. You don't get a clear cut or whatever. You get just a series of connections with no final radical resolution. Again, I'm a little bit tempted to defend Hegel, at least on two counts. First, it's not quite true that Hegel doesn't always opt for a clear-cut resolution. Maybe the most famous passage in entire Hegel in Phenomenology of master and servant, the fight, the result there is a compromise. They don't go to the end. The point is, if we fight really to the end, one will die, it has no sense. So it's a kind of a symbolic compromise there. Point two, even the form of the unconscious, this is Freud at his best, which is typically Hegelian unconscious. You also find it in Freud. For example, it's much more complex in Freud, but I give you the simplified gist of it. There is a patient woman who comes to Freud and says she remembers a dream, but it's uncertain dream. She cannot identify who the man is in the dream and so on. So it appears a purely formal uncertainty. I don't see it clearly and so on. And then Freud gets the point that this formal uncertainty is the form of the return to what the woman is not ready to confront at the level of content. What is repressed as content returned in the form. It's, to put it in vulgar terms, her uncertainty who is the father. Who's true? No? That this quite clear uncertainty of the content, she's not ready to admit it, so it returns as pure form. It's blurred, I don't know who that person is, and so on and so on. Then we have the problem of jouissance, of enjoyment as opposed to mere pleasure. Here also, what Hegel can think is nonetheless jouissance as such. He's not as stupid as it may appear. For example, in surprising places, look at his lessons on the philosophy of religion, when Hegel there talks about what is the aim of religious ritual. He says it's brutally to produce enjoyment. That, what happens in in praying, in the act of praying, Hegel is not bullshitting there. No, you are doing literally for your enjoyment, and so on. But nonetheless, the motive which is central for Freud and especially Lacan, the motive of the gap between the true and the real of jouissance. This gap, Hegel maybe cannot get it. Let me give you here a brief quote of one of late Lacan's seminars, seminar 29, from 76, where Lacan says, a quote, session of December 14th, 76, the true or the real. At this level, everything is set up as if these two terms are synonymous. But the unpleasant thing is that they are not. When we are dealing with the real, the true is in divergence, and so on and so on. So let's go then. Okay, we have other moments, but now let me start a defense of Hegel. Yes, sorry. We have, of course, then, as already mentioned, another crucial example, that of modern science. It is nonetheless unfortunately clear, here even I cannot fully defend Hegel, that his universe is not yet the universe of modern formalized science. It is clear in his uneasiness with Galileo and Newton how he tries to, as it were, supplement this natural science, emerging formal natural sciences, with some kind of a more conceptual underpinning. Hegel simply has no sense for this dimension here. And along the same lines, if I may permit myself a brief detour, I think that Adorno was right, if you like classical music, when he said that the greatest task of everyone who really likes Bach, the boring guy with music, to defend Bach against himself, against his defenders, no? Because it's very popular for the last 50 years to defend Bach as a kind of a pre-modern, organic, fully religious composer against later modernization, like, you know, in Bach as a traditional composer. You find peace in these large harmonious structures before all the modernist or even romantic excesses. But as Adorno points out, Bach is the Newton of music. You should just read a little bit of the historical situation of Bach. You know how Bach was perceived by his contemporaries as he was not very popular. Why? Because the idea was he is too much of a formalist, playing with abstract mathematical variations, not enough melody. The true reactionary was Bach's son, Christoph something, I don't know, who, it's interesting to learn, was towards the end of Bach's life much more popular than his father. Why? Because the reaction to Bach was Italian melody singing, which was precisely perceived as a return to authentic sentiments against all those abstractions and so on. What is crucial? Now I will make my point in a very simple way, of course. What is crucial is that, this is common topic, we know it all, how modernity proper emerges with this Cartesian formalized mathematical universe, but it's different mathematics from not only pre-modern, but even Renaissance mathematics. Here, for example, Kepler, although Marx, as a German nationalist, always says, no, Kepler better than Newton, but this is Marx German stuff. There, of course, you have elevation of mathematics, but it's part of this bullshit of harmonia mundi, cosmic music, harmony of the world, and so on. With Bach, it is precisely that we enter in a brutal way into this modern, as Pascal would have put it, silent, abstract universe where you cannot rely on any of these celestial harmonies between our world, celestial world. We are in an abstract world, and the whole problem of Bach is how to invent from his mathematical combination, an artificial harmony. He has to construct it. You no longer can rely on all these natural harmonies, on this Pythagorean bullshit, numbers, their secret meanings, and so on and so on. So, again, it's on the contrary, I claim, the reaction to Bach, which is in a way the reaction, or even there, my God, you see where my true love is, music and so on. Even there, all great guys were bothered by Bach. Bach is at the origin, literally, of end of classicism, of musical modernism. You know in what sense? You know what is the problem of the late Beethoven? He perfected what Haydn and Mozart did the sonata form, and then his big problems was he felt that in all this sonata bullshit, something precious that you find in Bach, Fugue, and so on is lost. So modernity, it's a very nice dialectic. Modernity started not as an attempt we are stifled by old forms, let's look forward, but no, by the insight that in the classical music, something was lost that was there in Bach, and that how to revitalize that part. Even at this level, I even am trying now to write something, but I'm not sure I will because it's too close to pure bluff, no? To save in a materialist way romanticism in music. Because I participated in some stupid round table in France where some people who really know thought that, if you look at really great romantic pieces of music, it's not spiritualism. Forget about all that bullshit about, beyond the misery of terrestrial life, whatever. No. The greatness of a guy in France explained it to me in wonderful terms. When we were listening to some wonderful, I underestimated him, piano piece by Felix Mendelssohn. How Romanticism proper begins when the moment melody is not simply given, but you have as if to struggle with the musical material to generate the melody, In Mozart, even early Beethoven, it's not a problem. The melody is here. You state it or the motive, and then you play all those stupid ballerina forms, variations on it. But the proper of Romanticism is this long struggle to painfully generate the melody. Even great okay, now I will admit, together with Badiou, he is also deep in this shit, my limitations. Like, Badiou once admitted to me, he told me, don't tell anyone. So, of course, that's called dialectic, that he likes Mahler, but that he discovered Mahler through Visconti, Death in Venice. You know that one, no? We got him here, no? I mean, no, you know who is Alain Badiou, no? The guy who thinks Bridges of the Madison County is a great film and so on, no? We got him. No, but seriously, take that famous adagietto that we all know. It's in all those, classical music in cinema, all those 99 pence DVDs with the troll. But what happens there, this is, I think, okay, it's late Romanticism already, but Romanticism at its purest. This painful, slow struggle for the melody to emerge. Again, I think it's a very materialist movement. And I think this is, now I will betray my low-class Balkan origins. This is what makes slightly boring, for example, Beethoven's late sonatas, no? Piano sonatas. That you already have this struggle with the material. And then, of course, all this explodes in Schumann, Schubert, and so on and so on. Or if you want other pieces, in my perverse attitude, I told myself that I asked myself, is Adorno really right to attack so ferociously, who are the two absolute bad guys for Adorno in music, Sibelius and Tchaikovsky. Like there it is like Adorno becomes Goebbelsian, like burn them. Like, no? But I think that if you know it, Sibelius' Fourth Symphony is nonetheless not total shit. I agree with Adorno that number 2, all those Finland stuff, freedom, blah, blah. But Fourth Symphony, go to the third movement, and it's, I think, even better than Adagietto of Mahler. This kind of a melody with pain trying to formulate itself, but it fails. Okay. So let's now go nonetheless back to Hegel. The point is, this would be my first basic point, that again, it's not a question of simply moving beyond Hegel, but it's the point is to demonstrate how what Hegel doesn't see, again, is not some post-Hegelian dimension totally outside his grasp, but the very Hegelian dimension of what is coming. For example, when Marx demonstrated in his Capital how the self-reproduction of capital obeys the logic of the Hegelian process of substance-subject, which retroactively posits its own presuppositions. The unheard of character of Marx does there is to, as it were, implicitly in Capital, he beats Hegel at its own terrain. His point is not, oh, Hegel, stupid idealist, here is real life. No, his point is, and I like this formulation, that the way to produce materialist Hegel is to claim that Hegel, in some crucial domains, wasn't idealist enough. Because, as Fred Jameson pointed it out very nicely in his this book on phenomenology, Variations on Phenomenology or whatever, is that Hegel's, I quote Fred Jameson, despite his familiarity with Adam Smith and emergent economic doctrine, Hegel's conception of work and labor, I have specifically characterized it as a handicraft ideology, betrays no anticipation of the originalities of industrial production or the factory system. That is to say, again, Hegel thinks in an almost naive materialist way that production is just me as a concrete individual working on some stuff and so on. What he doesn't see is a very Hegelian point, how in capitalism, this concrete interaction between me, others, and the stuff is regulated by the abstraction of the capital. How, precisely the Hegelian notional subject-substance is there. I'm so sad we don't have more time, or maybe I'm hypocritical here and it's nice, but please, I beseech you to read his politically, don't worry, when we take power he goes to Gulag. But nonetheless, he's not an idiot. Robert Pippin, the American Hegelian, who nonetheless, in his last good book, the latest one on Hegel, Hegel's Ethics or whatever is not good. But the previous one, The Persistence of Subjectivity, Pippin has a wonderful text along the same lines, it's worth reading, on Hegel and the modern art, where I think in a model-like way he shows how Hegel went too fast in predicting the end of art. Although, of course, Hegel knew this doesn't mean simply art will stop, whatever. But he claims that Hegel was not able to imagine art beyond representation, this realist representation and so on. And Pippin claims that, again, he was not Hegelian enough here, that if you just apply to visual arts Hegel's notion of subjective reflexivity, mediation, and so on, you can clearly, in a beautiful way, generate, in a purely Hegelian way, the concept of modern abstract painting. You see, this is, I think, how it should be done. So, okay, let me now go a little bit to go on. Let me now go a little bit to this Hegel and Marx topic. So, again, of course, you can say it's true that Hegel's limitation was here a purely historical one. Like, of course, he couldn't write about what he wasn't able to see. Although it's more complex, because I think the first financial crises were already there and so on. So it was a kind of self-blindness. So again, let me dwell a little bit on this. It is clear, for example, if you read The Capital of Marx, not only not only first chapter for value, forms of value, but especially, I think it's chapter 7, I'm not sure, the passage from money to capital. It's clearly formulated in Hegelian terms of the passage from substance to subject. With capital, value is no longer just a substance, the universality within which we exchange commodities, but it becomes subject in the sense of agent, self-positing, and so on and so on. And why maybe Hegel wasn't able to do it? I think I already quoted this passage here. It's from a book by a very good writer on Hegel who recently died, the French guy Gérard Lebrun, who says that what is so new in The Capital of Marx is that capital is a subject in the Hegelian sense, self-positing, self-mediating agent, but an automatic subject. That is to say, a subject which, again, we are back to repetition, just wants more profit, just blindly repeats itself. So again, a nice point. What Hegel wasn't able to think is not some dimension beyond, but this weird unity of subjectivity, which for Hegel is always life, living, creative subjectivity, a subjectivity which is at the same time that blindly repetitive. It's this unity of blind automatism, repetition, and conceptual self-mediation which Hegel missed there. Of course, things are here more complicated. I'm aware of it. That is to say, when Marx describes the dance of capital, capital's self-reproduction, as this Hegelian process of the substance, value, acting of subject, mediating itself, positing its presuppositions, and so on. Of course, for Marx, this is not the ultimate truth. For Marx, of course, the ultimate truth is that the autonomy of this process of self-generation of value, it's an ideological myth. Ultimately, it feeds itself on the exploitation of workers and so on and so on. But nonetheless, we can say that what Hegel describes here is something which is very mysterious, because it's not simply ideology in the sense of how bourgeois individuals perceive themselves, but it's not also the brutal reality, which is that of workers' exploitation. It's something in between that we can call the objective fantasy of capital. Again, here I don't want today to enter into all those problems of the ambiguous status of the reference to Hegel's dialectic in Marx. I already, I think, mentioned it. How, if you read it closely, you have two fundamentally different references in Grundrisse manuscripts. For Marx, the Hegelian dialectical process is still, let's call it naively, the model of liberation. You know that famous text, which is brilliant, of course, the pre-capitalist modes of production. This is a pure Hegelian rereading of history. You start with so-called primitive societies where you have the substantial unity, then you get gradual alienation, which reaches its high point with proletarians, pure abstract subjectivity from which all the substantial content is taken, and then you have reconciliation, subjectivity reconciled with substance. What happens in Capital is something totally different, I claim. There, Hegelian dialectical process is not a model for the process of liberation, but rather a model for the very alienated logic of the capitalist reproduction. And now the big question is here, I don't have time to enter into it today. The big question here would have been, was the late Marx simply right? This was the reading, this is the predominant reading of Frankfurt School. What we are, to put it in terms of the so-called Western Marxism, Lukács is the model of the first reading. Hegel's dialectical process is a mystified version of the process of liberation. Lukács, even in his History and Class Consciousness, says it literally. He says Hegel was right, he just applied his dialectical matrix on the wrong subject. He literally says, he must have known it, it's too simple, replace absolute spirit with working class and you got it. But Adorno, Marcuse and so on, for them, dialectic is not dialectic of liberation, but the very form of the self-reproduction of alienated society. So, and you have this permanent motive in Adorno, in Marcuse. I'm talking here about especially Hegel and Revolution, the younger Marcuse, who is much better and so on than the late one. Namely that this idea that liberation, communism, whatever we call it, will be a step out of dialectics. Dialectics is the logic of alienated society, where everything turns into its opposite and so on and so on. My solution here, again, this is kind of a blurb to arouse you, maybe, like read my book, is that I think we should do a much more daring move here. Namely, what I find problematic in both Lukács and Adorno and Marcuse is their reading of Hegel as if what Hegel calls reconciliation is the simple subjective appropriation of the substance. You know, you are the subject, you alienate yourself, you produce the substantial content, and then in communism you reappropriate it. I don't think Hegel is in this sense a subjectivist. I think if you really want to understand Hegel, you should see that what he calls reconciliation, it's not this like voracious subjective idea of, collective subject will swallow all reality or whatever. It's a much more, even I'm tempted to say, pessimist move. I'm so sad we don't have time, but I want to signal to you a novel that I really liked. And I think it's absolutely not a racist novel, as some people claimed. Again, I have a problem here. Can you help me? I know whatever I will say will be wrong, namely how to pronounce the name, the South African guy. Not Nadine, fuck you, even... Okay, whatever, yeah, okay. You know, of course I'm talking of his Disgrace. One of the darkest novels that I know. I think it's totally wrong to read it as simple reaction of a deceived liberal to the new South Africa. You know, like we fought for their freedom, now they treat us as if we are their tribal slaves or whatever. But what I want to say is that the final situation of the hero, you lose everything, this total loss. This is maybe the closest we get to Hegelian reconciliation. If you want to understand what Hegel means by reconciliation, read that. Now comes the 3 minutes of my boasting. No, I hate myself for doing it, which is why I like to do it. You know, yesterday I had tea with Rafe Fiennes, and he told me, that he would have been better. You saw the movie, you should buy it. You get a cheap Disgrace with John Malkovich. But Rafe told me that he was the first candidate and that he admitted it to me that he rejected it out of pure vanity. He told me it was 10 years ago. He wasn't even 40 at that point, and he said, no, I will not play a white guy who is 50. Pure. But I think maybe he would have been, for this bitterness and so on, maybe he would have been even better. Okay, so again, this is another topic. We don't have time to go into it now. This idea of that maybe the way to go back to Hegel is to abandon this basic hyper-idealist, subjectivist reading, as if Hegelian reconciliation means subject swallows everything. No, it's not that. I think it's something much closer to this Christian moment of, you get out of alienation not by overcoming it, but by way of redoubling it. The formula is for me the one that I always quote, that Hegel's formula, secrets of the Egyptians for us were also secrets for the Egyptians themselves. It's just this shift from my alienation from the substance to the substance being screwed up in itself already, to simplify things. But okay, let's not go this path. It would have brought us too much. The thing I want to draw your attention to is this simple fact, which is crucial, how to go beyond Hegel means paradoxically to discover a Hegelian dimension, like in modern art, modern abstract art, like in developed capitalism, to discover Hegelian dimension precisely in what Hegel wasn't able to grasp. Like what Hegel not only was not this absolute narcissist in the sense of, I see everywhere my own system. No, paradoxically, my point would have been that he wasn't enough of a narcissist, no? He didn't see, for example, how contemporary capitalism is more Hegelian sometimes than Hegel himself. Then there is the third point, which brings us, it's a very delicate point, to the true limit of Hegel, unfortunately. Social limit, but which has conceptual consequences. Namely, Hegel comes at that point where we have a passage from traditional society, master servitude, to modern bourgeois society of formal equality and freedom. And maybe precisely because he wasn't able to think capitalism properly, what Hegel couldn't have imagined, I think, is the basic paradox of capitalist societies, which is that you have formal legal equality, we are all free citizens, but that relationship of domination reproduces itself precisely under the form of equality. I don't think Hegel was able to think domination, class distinction, domination, which is still here even when you abolish all traditional forms of direct domination. And here I would like again to quote Fred Jameson, a wonderful passage where he says that in a modern democracy, the social leveling we are witnessing in modern democracy, I quote Jameson, certainly does not exclude the emergence of wealth and of profound distinctions between rich and poor, even in the socialist countries. Nor is it in any way to be understood as the end of classes in their economic sense. There are still workers and managers in these societies. There is still profit and exploitation, reserve armies of the unemployed, and so on. But the new cultural equality is infused with a powerful hatred of hierarchy and special privileges, and with a passionate resentment of caste distinctions and inherited cultural superiority. Now comes, maybe you already know it, the brilliant phrase. It is in our societies permitted to be wealthy so long as the rich man is as vulgar as everyone else, I think this is the paradox, but a wonderful, again, Hegelian paradox, which I claim gives to us an unexpected possibility of a genuine proletarian reappropriation of the high culture. So, what's my point here? Again, that all these three cases that I enumerated seem to call for a Hegelian analysis. Workers reduced to an appendix of machinery. A hierarchy persisting in the very form of plebeianization, and so on and so on. Here, we have to go to think further than Hegel. And now I want to make, again, another step further, and just in the remaining half an hour, explain, apropos of a couple of cases, how Hegel was not consequent enough measured by his own standards. Already yesterday, I think, I mentioned this paradox of the king, how the proper king should be an idiot who just, and so on and so on. And that it's difficult to be a king because to be a good king, you must accept that you are a pure puppet, an idiot. I want to give you, I'm sorry if I repeat myself, maybe I already used it years ago, an ultimate example of what does it mean, king's utter alienation. There is, I'm sorry if you know it, an anecdote from the Prussian-Austrian War in 1866. This was one of the last battles still done in a traditional way. You know, soldiers fighting in the valley, up on the hills, the king with his headquarters observing the battle. So in this last battle, the Prussian king, formerly the supreme commander of the Prussian army, was observing the fight from a nearby hill. He was very worried because it appeared to him that his troops were retreating, that there is at least a confusion. And then, all of a sudden, General von Moltke, the great Prussian strategist who planned this battle, you know, in the middle of this chaos, the king sweating, oh my God, are we losing? Ours are retreating. The guy who knew what is happening, General, turned to the king and told him, may I be the first to congratulate your majesty for a brilliant victory, you know, because he knew we won. But this, I think, is what I like. Like, the king formally won, but he was a total idiot, he didn't know. But it must be attributed to you. This is what, in a way, I think Lacan means when he talks about the decentered subject. There is no subject more decentered than the king. So I think here Marx is wrong in his critique of Hegelian notion of monarchy, in his notes towards critique of Hegel's philosophy of law, where Marx, apropos Hegelian deduction of monarchy, explodes. He says that for Hegel, and he thinks this is a great critical point he's making against Hegel, that for Hegel, king is nothing more than an appendix to his penis. But my point is that this precisely is what Hegel wants to say. That is to say, Hegel's point is precisely that king is a pure symbolic authority. As Hegel says, literally, repeating Kierkegaard, okay, Kierkegaard comes after, who repeats whom, that the duty of Hegel is not to understand anything. His bureaucrats have to understand things. The duty of the king is to sign his name, which means that in actuality, his duty is to breed his successor. It's the point where pure ideality of a pure signifier, I sign my name, coincides with its opposite, with just your duty is to behave nicely and breed children. Don't be wise, and so on. Now, why this? Now, we'll be very short because I know that here I repeat myself. Because Hegel knew something a lesson which we had to learn in a hard way in the 20th century. That when you have a government grounded, which tries to be grounded fully in effective qualities of the leaders, you get what we called totalitarianism. That in order for a power structure to function in a minimally open way, you have to have some kind of contingency on the top. And that's Hegel's point. That the whole point of having a monarch is not to allow all the power to state bureaucracy, to have some empty, totally contingent checkpoint on the top. In this sense, it's the dialectical beauty. Hegel's state of reason means precisely you have to include the moment of pure irrationality on the top. And I think that the same goes even for true democracy. I'm more and more convinced that democracy needs a moment of contingency, of lottery. My God, ancient Greeks were aware of it. In Venice, in their great epoch, they were aware of it. This is the horror of Stalinism, that Stalin precisely wasn't like a king or a despot. No, he pretended to know, really, the greatest scientists, and so on and so on. We have to admit this gap. Of course, we can debate, and I agree with it, that Hegel didn't see that democracy can also function as introducing this element of contingency. I agree with those who claim. But nonetheless, when Hegel spoke about the king as this moment of pure contingency on the top, he saw something very deep. The next problem, what Hegel didn't, maybe for conformist political reason, wasn't able to accept is that we have this irrational excess on the top, the king, pure biology, pure contingency, and then, I mean, Hegel is really aware of it. I mean, again, read his philosophy of right, where he says, but if king is determined by pure contingency of birth, doesn't this mean that the fate of the state is left to natural caprice? Like the way the king is born, I don't know, if he is furious, we will have more wars or whatever. And then Hegel says, no, you miss the point. King just signs the papers. It doesn't matter what kind of character he is and so on. But then I think what Hegel didn't see is to connect this excess on the top, excess of irrationality, with the excess on the bottom, the so-called Rabble, Pöbel, this part of no part of the social body. I already spoken about it, so I will be brief here. You know what's the point. Hegel saw very clearly that modern capitalist society has its classes and so on, but it necessarily produces an excess of rebel, of those for whom there is no place within the social body. And Hegel even openly admitted that there is no solution. Hegel says we are trying to deal with it, and he just pragmatically enumerates solutions, like colonization, charity, whatever. But he says in the long term it will not work, because he is well aware of this circular paradox, because he says the more we are getting rich, the more we necessarily produce the rebel. Again, I'm repeating here myself, so I will be brief, I know. What, for political reasons, I claim, Hegel was not ready to admit is how this part of no part, the rebel, precisely insofar as it has no specific place within social body, stands immediately for the universality. This idea of the excess is the place of universality, this was too much for Hegel. But again, following his theory, he should have said it. Here, here everything is decided, like, was Hegel a proto-fascist or not? I claim that by refusing to draw this conclusion, Hegel came dangerously close to that soft fascist tendency, which was then later fully developed by the conservative English neo-Hegelians like MacTaggart and so on. No, this idea that, you know, the Hegelian vision is to counteract abstract individuality by way of constructing kind of a state of estates where everyone is at his or her own place and so on. But again, Hegel knew, this is the ABC of Hegelian dialectic, that you never can find peace in such a harmonious, articulated social body, that always universality has to assert itself as such against its particular embodiments, in the guise of war, in the guise here of, in the guise of the rebel, and so on and so on. Okay, but I already spoke about it, so let's go on. We have now already this kind of excesses. We have the excess of the king, where precisely you see the paradox, the top of the social hierarchy, the king, is reduced in a way to pure animality. No, it's at the same time the highest, pure name, but in its reality, totally alienated. We have this. We have rebel. And again, here, as many intelligent writers, interpreters of Hegel noticed, Hegel is very clear. He basically, not even between the lines, you just have to read him, he legitimizes revolution. Because he says, this rebel, these are people to whom society denied basic recognition. So he says they don't owe anything to society. If they rebel, we have no right to condemn them. But nonetheless, again, this idea, which was later articulated by Marx, that precisely the working class as no class, as the class which cannot realize itself as a class, stands for the universality of humanity, no? This is, again, what unfortunately the conclusion Hegel doesn't draw apropos Rabble, but I think that this is where Hegel is actual today, because if there is now, there are some ultra-orthodox traditional Marxists here, they will explode against me. But I claim that the point is not to do what traditional Marxist readers of Hegel did, by claiming, this was the limit of Hegel, he used this vague term, rebel, but now we know it's the working class, and so on. No, if anything, today, with whatever you call it, late capitalism. I don't like the term because capitalism is late from its beginning. My standard joke. Like Marx was saying capitalism is rotting. No? As a matter of fact, the first guy to say that capitalism is rotting were already the British romantics, I think. No? Then Lenin said imperialism, the last stage, rotting capitalism. Then Mao said American imperialism in 1950s, that this last stage got so absolutely rotten that, but okay, unfortunately, the more it is rotting, the better it is doing. No. Okay, what I want to say now is that aren't we today in our stage of capitalism, in a way, partially at least, returning from the unique position of proletariat, as self-conscious working class, to rebel. By rebel, I mean different kinds of exclusions, of those who are excluded. In other words, it seems clear to me that we no longer can count on only, exclusively, or even predominantly on working class as such. I think that capitalism has learned today to play in a much more cynical way with the working class. This is even to refer today, but here I fully support you. I think I mentioned this the first day here. Just look, I don't know how it is again in your country, but in my country, look at the status of strikes today. 90% I support them, but I was opposed to strikes in my country. Why? Because I already told you to some of the strikes. In my country, Slovenia, now, the situation is horrible. Construction workers, textile working women, they are just fired and so on. They don't dare to strike, not even to raise their voice, because if they strike, they tell them, fuck off, perfect. Those who can strike, the tragedy is that in some countries, strike can even be a privilege today. You must have a very firm position to even be able to afford a strike. Like in Slovenia, who is striking? Doctors who are already relatively very well paid, judges are striking, obstructing, policemen like to strike. Everybody loves how corrupted they are and so on, no? And stupid, This is what I like, nonetheless, in Slovenia. It still has this old socialist legacy of the Western countries. I think only France had it. That policemen are stupid, And you have all these jokes of how they are, for example, these standard jokes, like, why are the policemen always three in a group? With one knows how to read, the other how to write, and the third one controls them if they read or write correctly, or whatever. Or my favorite one, I'm sorry, it's slightly vulgar, but is about, it combines stupidity and corruption. A policeman comes home and hears, just entering the door, some of these, okay, I will not make them, sex voices, no? So he enters and sees her wife a little bit red in the face. Of course, he got it, no? His wife was screwing someone. So he says, I will find him, no? Looks around, then looks beneath the bed. For 20 seconds, you hear nothing, no? And then he comes up and says, okay, I was mistaken, everything is okay, and so on and so on, no? And then later we learn to his friend what happened. No, he looked down and he says to his friend, you know, I made some money because the guy who was screwing my wife bribed me so that I said there is nobody there. And this time, you know, these people strike in Slovenia, no? No, it really, here I'm really becoming a classical working class defender. Women who were working in a textile factory for 30 years, my God. And now all they get is this postmodern bullshit, you know, recreate yourself, this is an opportunity to invent a new job or whatever, no? So again, all this points out towards how maybe there is a time to re-actualize Hegel's notion of rebel. Precisely as the name, you know, because, again, you know my old thesis that capitalism today is no longer, and I think it will be less and less able, even to sustain its own normative structure, which is that of exploitation under the pretext of full personal freedom, legal equality, and so on. I think more and more, obviously, it needs forms of partial exclusion, like immigrant workers, outsourcing, and so on and so on. So, okay, my next point is that the same structure of an excess which stands for universality would have been, again, another thing which I think would be very helpful is, again, another reason why it is productive to connect these two excesses, excess at the top, excess at the bottom, is that if we unite these two, the contingent excess on the top, the excess on the bottom, rebel, isn't this the formula of a populist authoritarian regime? As Marx says, what is the secret of Napoleon III? That, okay, he pretended to, in a corporate way, proto-fascist way, to represent every class, no? Giving its proper to workers, to farmers, to them. But as Marx put it, his only true social base was the thugs, the rebel. And again, the same with Hitler, SA thugs, and so on and so on. Okay, but this is another topic. What I want now to go on is to show how there is another, which I already developed, I just repeat it again, another excess of Hegel, where he clearly makes a mistake with regard to his own logic, sex. I mean, there is a certain image of Hegelian process, which is that of simple, gradual, evolutionary culturalization, in the sense of, to put it very simply, if you conceive sex as a natural substance, we copulate like animals, but then you say, but we humans are more and more conferring a cultural form on it, like I like a woman or a man likes me, or two men like me, so that you will not accuse me of binary logic, whatever. Yeah, this is where Judith Butler was furious of me, you know, because once I debated and I said, okay, 2 women, 3 men, because she's always attacking me from binary logic. And so I told her, okay, now you will get more than binary logic. Okay, but what I want to say is that, so again, the idea is, I like someone and I'm a cultured man, so instead of raping him, her, beating, I write poems, blah, blah, blah. We do it in a cultivated form. But what Hegel didn't get, but he should have gotten it, is that it's not that we simply pass from nature to culture. The moment you have culture, there should be an excess of denaturalized nature. And we have a name in eroticism for this excess. The name is this, Tristan and Isolde, absolute sexual passion, which is self-destructive, you know, this Tristan Isolde idea. Let's lose ourselves in the self-destructive ecstasies of absolute enjoyment, of love, death, and so on. So, again, what Hegel didn't see is that what we are trying to control, gentrify, domesticate, through sexual rituals, symbolic forms, is not directly nature, but it's already an excess over nature. And okay, to repeat another of my ancient points, this is where I think if we are true Hegelians, we can nicely show how right was Lacan, namely where Catholic Church is wrong apropos sexuality. This idea that the only civilized sexuality is ultimately for procreation, and that sexuality done only for lust is like, it makes us like beasts, and so on and so on. You know, I claim that, again, the structure is much more complex. The reason Catholic Church is, insofar as it is, I know it's more complex, but basically, nonetheless, the basic model of sinning is to engage in illicit sexual activity. It's that it fights sexuality not in the sense of higher spiritual vocation fighting elementary biological life, but one spirituality fighting another spirituality. Secretly, they know that the first proto-metaphysical experience, by metaphysical experience, I mean something very simple. I mean, you are engaged into something which goes beyond your biological interest. You know, you are literally in a Platonic way. You know, you are struck by something, you are ready to sacrifice everything for it. Sexual lust is this, my God. It's absolutely not procreative. And Hegel knew it in some of his writings. Namely, what he knew is that when you have a certain purposeful activity which serves a purpose, the way you, an instrumental, biological, simple purpose, the way you spiritualize it is to take part of this activity and posit it as an end in itself. Like, you make love no longer for procreation. In this way, love becomes, or sex even, becomes a space to realize a kind of metaphysical radical passion. In other words, Catholics are totally wrong here, I claim. It's precisely when you do sex for procreation that you are like animals. Animals, solely, they do like that. You know, they copulate in certain rhythms, times of the year, and so on. We are, okay, we want to, we cannot, but we are ready to do it in principle all the time. But so you see my point. I claim that this is the message of Freud. It's a very nice one. This should be the proper Freudian Hegelian answer to spiritualists. It's not, oh, you believe in some shitty spiritualism, we know the only reality is power, sex, whatever. No, that we see spirituality where you oppress it. We see a properly metaphysical dimension in it. Which is why, I'm so sad I don't have time for it, but which is why I also think that church is totally wrong in its, you know, this, my God, I hate them here when they say, you know, this is supposedly a deep thing to say. Today's crisis is not economic, it's spiritual, ethical crisis. No, the first thing to say here is that Benjamin was right. Capitalism is deeply an ethico-religious phenomenon. What is wrong with capitalists, greedy capitalists, is not that they are too egotists. They are not. A true capitalist, it's a pale, half-dead fanatic who is ready to forsake all his pleasures just so that, you know, the capital turns around more and more profit and so on and so on. So again, I claim when we advocate ecology against capitalist exploitation, it's not a struggle of proper altruistic humanity against some brutal egotism. No, I claim it's precisely a struggle of simple egotism for you, maybe for your children, against this metaphysics of capitalism, literally metaphysics. Because isn't capitalism metaphysics embodied? In what sense? You have things really happening. This is the physical dimension. People working, consuming, whatever. And then you have, it's literally more and more a separate sphere. What goes on in Wall Street and so on, these purely virtual financial speculations, which literally ideas rule the world. Something is happening in this virtual space which decides the fate of material production. You know, this is for me the metaphysical dimension of capitalism. You work in a company, you think everything is okay, then there is some Wall Street speculation and your company goes bankrupt. And it's totally non-transparent for you. You say, but what was wrong? The product is selling well, we were working well, and so on and so on. So again, I think that here I think that this is, again, the point of Freudian sexuality. It's not kind of a vulgar biological reductionism. It's exactly the opposite. And intelligent, how is that French mystic woman called? Is it Simone Weil? Yeah. She saw this wonderfully when she wrote how once in one of her mystical meditations of how even in the lowest sexual passion, you can see metaphysical union, metaphysical dimension at its purest. And incidentally, she also has, I don't have, unfortunately, time to quote it now. She also put it in wonderful way, this idea of a proletarian position, this idea that in every society, there are those who are reduced to nothing and so on, and they are the only one who, from their very position, are telling the truth, and so on, and so on. So, just to conclude now, if you read Hegel in this way, that is to say, if you insist on an excess of negativity, which persists beyond any sublation, which is always there as a threat, like the necessity, and you have different expressions of this, like the necessity of war as the untying of social links. In war, we are all reduced to singular individuals ready to die if you are, for our country. That is to say, all the complex social structure no longer matters. You have rebel. You have madness, you have passionate sexual love. All these are examples of this excess of radical negativity, and it is clear that we are dealing here with the Hegelian version of precisely a form of repetition. So I claim that nonetheless Hegel had this dimension of repetition, but was not ready fully to confront it. So again, maybe I should now slowly stop, not to become a counter-revolutionary, no?